Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kelvin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and it's time to talk about some card nerfs, or as Blizzard would like to call them, bug fixes, but in reality, they're just nerfs. And if you watch this video, you'll see what I mean. But in a patch released today, Blizzard announced some bug fixes to a handful of cards which are very clearly going to reduce their power level. Namely, Tess Greymane, Lanessa Sunsorrow, Kingsbane, and Rummaging Kobold have all had changes introduced which are going to make them considerably worse as Hearthstone cards. And since these weren't officially deemed nerfs, nobody is going to get dust refunds for any of these cards, despite the fact that their playability and in some cases their fun level have been reduced. And that sucks. That's frankly pretty darn lame by Blizzard to silently and secretly behind the scenes nerf these cards, make negative adjustments, but not reward players who might have crafted them hoping they did a specific thing. That's terrible. That said, let's go ahead and jump into each of these, talk about what I mean, why they're nerfs, not just bug fixes, and discuss the implications of these changes towards these cards' competitive viability in Hearthstone. So up first here, we have Tess Greymane, and you'll note nothing looks different about this card at all. None of the numbers or mana cost or even the card text have been changed, but nonetheless, behind the scenes, Tess Greymane is going to operate a little bit differently. Now, first and foremost, there actually was a real legitimate bug fix in that Tess Greymane will now play hero cards. So when you play like, Malfurion or Rexar or whatever it might be, she will successfully replay those. That's a pretty weird and rare interaction because typically if you turn into another hero, you're no longer a rogue and you don't replay that hero because you already are that hero and it's not from a different class. But in scenarios specifically where you play like Malfurion and then you turn back into Valeera and become a rogue again, in that scenario, you could replay Malfurion now, whereas in the past you couldn't. So that's a good change. It's a very, very, very small positive impact, but nonetheless, a good thing to happen for Tess Greymane. Now, the other part of this text you'll see on screen above me here is that Tess Greymane's battle cry is now limited to 30 cards. That's not that big of a deal. Very, very rarely will that ever matter. More importantly, she will stop casting the battle cry if she is silenced, killed, transformed, leaves the battlefield, or if any hero dies. And that text in that wording might sound really familiar because that's exactly what happened to Yogg-Saron a long time ago when he got nerfed. Officially, Blizzard called it a nerf. They said, we're nerfing Yogg-Saron. None of the card text is changing, but behind the scenes, if he gets destroyed, silenced, transformed, returned to its owner's hand, he's no longer going to be casting his battle cry. So that reduced the consistency and total power output of Yogg-Saron really significantly because sometimes it would just fireball itself right off the bat and it would die and you just get nothing for your Yogg-Saron play. That reduced him from an incredibly competitive, life-saving, game-swinging kind of card to more of a meme that only rarely got played in actual competitive Hearthstone. So a nerf, and they rightfully gave people a dust refund for Yogg-Saron. But Tess Greymane, the exact same thing is happening. Literally exactly the same. And they're not giving you a refund for Tess Greymane. Now, clearly Tess Greymane is not a really strong, competitively driving Hearthstone card like Yogg-Saron was at the time of his nerf. But nonetheless, she's getting worse. This makes her much, much worse. The same kinds of problems can happen. She can instantly polymorph herself or fireball herself or in some other ways ruin her battle cry effect early, thus reducing her total power output and making her a less viable play. Is she good today? No, but this makes her even worse. And despite the fact that she's maybe not in a super competitive deck right now, people still craft cards for fun because they want to play them. I love playing Burgle Rogue with Tess Greymane myself. And if I crafted this card specifically to play it because I thought it was fun and awesome, and it's getting worse, I should be getting a refund for that dust, or for that dust that I've spent, and for that nerf. Now, some people will say, well, Regis, this really is a bug fix. It's not a nerf. Well, then why is Yogg-Saron a nerf when the exact same thing happened? This is absolutely 100% a nerf to the card. People should get refunded. Now, is this going to make Tess Greymane worse? Absolutely. She will be worse. Will she go from playable to unplayable? No. Still a fringe card, still a fringe deck. I don't see her becoming particularly viable in the near future. Certainly future expansions can open up that opportunity, but it's going to be a lot harder for Tess Greymane to work now than it was before the nerf, because essentially, 1 out of 10 times she'll kill herself and end your play, and that lack of consistency or reduced consistency makes her a far less reliable card and a much riskier sort of play. So pretty substantial nerf, much like Yogg-Saron went from awesome card, one of the best cards in the game, to fringe card. Tess Greymane is going to go from a moderately playable card to an even less playable card. And that's a pretty unfortunate thing, specifically because it's so sneaky and underhanded as far as I'm concerned in execution from Blizzard. So Tess Greymane isn't alone. There were some other cards, first of which is Lanessa Sunsorrow, also nerfed under the guise of a bug fix. Now, I will admit this one isn't as significant or underhanded in its execution, and I don't really think this will impact the power level of Lanessa Sunsorrow quite as much, but nonetheless does make her distinctly worse. Because, first off, her battlecry is limited to 30 cards. Again, that's fairly minor, does have some potential impact, things like Sound the Bells, sure, but that's not that big a deal. The real nerf here is that Lanessa Sunsorrow will now cast the buffs in a random order. Currently, if you didn't know this, Lanessa Sunsorrow will actually cast the buffs on herself in the exact same order you cast them throughout the game. So if your deck was built in a specific way, you could do things like Dino Size first, and then Blessed Champion second, and your Lanessa Sunsorrow would turn into a 10-10 and then get her attack doubled. What could happen now is that you could play Lanessa Sunsorrow, she could cast Blessed Champion first, and then Dino Size second. So she'd be a 10-10 instead of a 20-10. Now, again, that's a pretty minimal impact. Nobody's really building Lanessa Sunsorrow decks specifically to use buffs in those sorts of orders. It's just not that viable of a thing to do. But nonetheless, this does remove a level of control. Even if your deck isn't meant specifically for some kind of shenanigan, there are scenarios and situations where you might want to Divine Shield first with Potion of Heroism and then cast a buff second, or vice versa. You never quite know, depending on what you might want to set up. And you had that level of control currently in Hearthstone that's going to be taken away from you. So they just added more RNG and less consistency to Lanessa Sunsorrow. So at the high end, if you're really calculated, pretty significantly worse with things like Blessed Champion Dino Size. Regular play, not nearly as impactful, but still a minor negative adjustment that does make the card a little bit less good. So does this change the impact of Lanessa Sunsorrow in Hearthstone? Not really. I think she's roughly as viable post-nerf as she is currently in Hearthstone, which is to say not all that competitive. She's a pretty fringe card at the moment, certainly. But again, a negative adjustment, a card that is distinctly worse. As far as I'm concerned, players who have Lanessa Sunsorrow should get a full dust refund when they disenchant her, because Blizzard did change the card. That one guy out there who loves his Dino Size Blessed Champion deck, he deserves a refund because they broke it, and maybe that's why he crafted it. And I think it's incredibly unfortunate that Blizzard's being so stingy here with these bug fixes and not calling them nerfs just to essentially not have to give away some arcane dust. That's not very fun. And then finally, maybe the most confusing and odd nerf set of all here. It's kind of weird to call these nerfs because they kind of only impact each other, but realistically, both of these cards become far worse because of this change in an interaction. And as you can see above me, basically, the new text says here, the bug fix says, as Kingsbane is not destroyed when its death rattle triggers, Rummaging Kobold will no longer retrieve it. So the argument being made is that, well, Kingsbane doesn't really die. It shuffles itself into your deck. So the death rattle isn't really on death. It sort of stays alive and moves itself as opposed to dying and resummoning in some weird, way. It's so silly to talk about this because the mechanic exists as it exists. To try to talk about it in some sort of higher level understanding is absurd. And that's why this is fundamentally an odd change to make. So because Rummaging Kobold's text says return one of your destroyed weapons to your hand, and Kingsbane isn't technically destroyed, these cards no longer interact. So essentially this interaction is kind of broken. Now, admittedly, this interaction isn't particularly important to Kingsbane decks. They have other ways to get their Kingsbane via Cavern Shiny Finder, and you don't really need to return a destroyed copy to your hand anyway. That's not a strategy that is currently utilized by Kingsbane in either standard format or in wild format. So it's not like this is making Kingsbane Rogue worse necessarily in its operation, in actual practice, in live Hearthstone. This isn't necessarily the biggest deal, but it just adds this completely unnecessary level of confusion. Because how can a death rattle trigger if the weapon isn't destroyed? For instance, consider this. Acidic Swamp Ooze, Battle Cry, destroy your opponent's weapon. And of course, that works against Kingsbane. It destroys the weapon, it breaks on your character's model, and then it does a thing. Of course, Kingsbane, when it breaks, it moves itself into your deck, but it still got destroyed. The act of destruction means it is no longer equipped. It does not mean in some ethereal sense that the card has been demolished. That's such an absurd distinction to draw, and it adds this really weird interaction, unnecessarily confusing things. For instance, the card Grave Shambler, another one, when your weapon is destroyed, gain +1/+1. Does that mean that Kingsbane no longer activates Grave Shambler? I don't know. They didn't talk about it here, but it's the exact same language. And does that mean Acidic Swamp Ooze doesn't work against Kingsbane because it's not actually destroyed? I don't know. And by the way, the wording on this in the first place is confusing, as Kingsbane is not destroyed when its death rattle triggers. No, of course, its death rattle triggers because it's destroyed, not that it's destroyed because its death rattle triggers. That's a completely different direction that these words should operate in. So I absolutely don't know why they felt this was necessary. Maybe there's gonna be some card in the future that makes this a really important distinction that we don't know about from a future expansion, and it's really, really important that they set this precedent now. I'm having trouble envisioning what that could be or what that could mean, but for now, this is a little bit of a nerf, once again, to both of these cards. Is it a substantial, meaningful nerf? No, not really. It doesn't change how these cards interact in real Hearthstone play, but nonetheless, that one guy running the weird Rummaging Kobold Kingsbane deck, guess what? His cards got worse together. I think he deserves a dust refund. I think you can't change cards in a negative direction and in a negative capacity without offering some sort of refund to players. So once again, both of these got nerfed, although in a tiny, tiny, tiny minor way. Throw out the refund, Blizzard. Give us that dust back. Now, that said, some weird nerfs / bug fixes. I can do this all day because I don't really understand why these things are happening. But it's kind of crazy, kind of silly. Tess Greymane got significantly, realistically worse. Very, very unfortunate. The other cards, probably didn't change all that much at the end of the day, but still, Blizzard is being stingy and a little bit underhanded in how they're addressing these things. Give people their dust, Blizzard. Stop being stingy, man. You don't do enough nice things. Now, that said, there is a nice new bundle being introduced to the pack today to coincide with these bug fixes. There are some new events coming. All of that stuff's awesome, but don't stop there. When you change cards, make sure you're not ruining anybody's day. It doesn't hurt to offer a little bit of extra dust here and there. In fact, guess what? I would say it makes your game more beloved. People have more fun. They're more likely to spend money at the end of the day. So, are these nerfs a huge deal? No. Are they actually nerfs? I think so, not just bug fixes. That said, I'm really curious what you guys have to say. What do you make of all this? What's up with the weird wording for destroyed? What's up with the Tess Greymane fix? Why is that necessary? We may never know, but I'm curious what your insights into this matter might offer. But until then, of course, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.